Hello, friends. This is Mr. Alper here with a presentation on the basic elements of fiction. We'll be looking at all these things: plot, conflict, character, etc. For many of you, some of these terms are going to be pretty familiar. You've probably learned some, if not all of them. Some of you may not know any of them at all. And some of you are probably, most of you, I guess, are somewhere in between. You know a good number of these terms, you've used them. So for those elements, these will be reviews. This will be a review for you. But we'll also hope to deepen your understanding of what these elements are and how they work in fiction. And just so you know, we're not having you learn these terms just to learn them, but to strengthen and reinforce your reading skills and also your writing skills. These elements are found in almost all works of fiction to some extent. And the better you understand what they are and how they work, the better you can comprehend what you read, the better you can appreciate the skill that went into making the text that you've read, and the more able you are to apply those techniques in your own writing. Also, it's worth keeping in mind that while these are elements of fiction, many of them, if not all of them, relate just as well to nonfiction writing as well. So hopefully, the better you understand them, the more you can apply them in your own writing, no matter what kind of writing you're doing. So let's dive right in. Please take notes as we go through. Since this is a video, you can pause it if you need to slow down to take down any notes. You can break up your viewing of it. Keep in mind when taking notes from any presentation, even a recorded one, the goal is not to simply copy word for word everything that's in the presentation, all the words that appear on the screen or that are spoken by the presenter, but rather to put the information as much in your own words as possible so you're really processing it. So let's dive right in. Basic elements of fiction. Just like artists, a painter, and someone who draws uses the colors and textures and materials that their tools enable them to create with, a writer uses certain tools as well to create literary works of art, and that includes nonfiction literary works. So like an artist's tools are pencils or paintbrushes and paints and so on. An author's tools are basically words, but you can also use, just like an artist uses paintbrushes or pencils to create and to work with color and form and shape and depth and so on. Artists who use words use those words to create plot, conflict, character, etc. So they're basically the building blocks of a work of literature. So we'll start with plot. Because when people say, what was that story about? Usually the first thing they mean is the plot. That is, what happens, the series of events in the story. I have here the bullet point says it's the structure of the story. In a way, they don't always overlap. There are some stories that have a plot that would go from point A to point Z. The structure doesn't always go A, B, C, D, E, F. It might actually jump around. It might have flashbacks and so on, in which case the structure may actually be more complex than the plot. Okay? But generally speaking, especially simple plots, the sequence of events are what structure the story. So that's the plot. And that's usually the answer to the question, what happened in that story? Plots almost always involve some kind of conflict, and we'll get to what that is in a moment. So here you have whatever it is that happened to Lizzie the lizard that has upset that boy so much. That's the conflict that will trigger some sort of plot. Either he'll try to revive Lizzie by bringing her to the vet, or he'll try to investigate whoever it was that poisoned poor Lizzie, or something like that. Most, but not all plots, typically will follow a sequence, the same kind of sequence, sometimes referred to as the plot arc because it kind of swoops upward and then downward. And the main parts of most complete plots include the exposition, the beginning. Now you may wonder, why do we say exposition instead of introduction? And that's probably because the term introduction can mean a lot of other things, the beginnings of lots of other things. Plots are we typically say they begin with an exposition because authors will very often just sort of reveal the situation at the beginning. They'll expose the situation rather than actually formally introducing it, saying, this story is set so and so and includes these main characters. Instead, they gradually expose enough details of the characters in the conflict for the audience, the readers, to understand where the plot's going. So that exposition then leads to, after the conflict is introduced, it leads to some complications that the conflict develops. The relationship between the characters develop in a certain way that either moves the conflict along or adds more conflict to the story. Short stories very often have one pretty simple direct conflict, while novels and full-length movies and so on may have many conflicts. And so they might actually have more than one strand of rising action. But basically the rising action is as the plot gets complicated. And typically, but again, not always, most, if not all, stories bring that rising action up to a head. They bring it to a high point of tension and drama, and that's the climax. The conflict comes to a head there, and very often that's also where it resolves, especially in short stories, because short stories don't allow much space. So very often, as soon as the conflict is at its greatest tension, it gets resolved somehow. The bad guy gets killed, or the loving couple get married, or something like that. So they happen together very often, but in some cases, after that climactic point, after that rise in the conflict up to a head, up to a point of maximum tension, there may be a kind of aftermath to it, where we see what happens right after that climax. And very often that falling action is where we end up with a resolution, some way of concluding the conflict. So the conflict is either considered over or it may be left hanging, in which case you might say the resolution is unresolved. Again, sometimes you don't even get any falling action. You'll go right from the climax to the resolution, or the resolution will occur with the climax. Sometimes you'll get a resolution and then a falling action afterwards. You might get a little sort of epilogue, some sort of tying up of other loose ends after the main conflict. So this plot arc is pretty consistent, but it's not absolutely predictable, especially those last parts. So the plot arc looks roughly like this. Exposition may start off slow. Sometimes you have an exposition that gets right into the thick of things, right into the conflict, and the rising action starts right away. It goes up to a climax. And this particular diagram showing the falling action and the resolution kind of stretched out, that's not actually, that angle would not be typical of most stories. Most stories end pretty soon after the climax, and the resolution is much shorter than all the rest of the story. But we dragged it out in this image just so you could see all 5 parts of it. So that's the plot. Generally, you can't have a plot, or it's difficult to write a good story that people care about with a plot if there are no characters. So characters are the people, the individuals who act out the events in the story. I said people, but I'm sure some of you have probably read stories about animals or seen movies or plays about animals. So they're whoever it is, whoever the living beings are who are performing the actions. Now, we categorize the different kinds of characters as either round or flat, and either static or dynamic. Round characters are characters that actually have dimensions to them. They have depth. They actually have layers to them, so they seem more believable, like real people who often have contradictions in themselves or conflicts within themselves. So those are called round characters, and they're contrasted with flat characters who are more cartoon-like. They may not be as fully developed as to create a sense that they're real people. Doesn't necessarily mean that the author wasn't skillful in making them. In fact, flat characters can be very entertaining and very interesting. They don't communicate to us a sense of lots of depth in their personality. Characters can also be static or dynamic, meaning they can either stay the same pretty much on the inside from beginning to end, or they can change in a significant way. And by change, we don't mean necessarily physically change. It usually means more an emotional or psychological change. They've been altered, they've grown up because of the experience. In case you're wondering, the word static, the relationship it has to like static over the air when you're listening to the radio, has to do with static electricity. Electricity can either be current electricity, it goes through a wire in a direction, or if it's static, it stays in one place. It's related to the same word as statue and stationary. So static electricity clings to things like antennas, and that's what will cause the interference that may cause, a fuzziness of sound. So that's why it's called static. But static, literally, the word just means not changing. Dynamic is related to words like dynamite, which is a material that releases energy all of a sudden. It's related to words meaning energy. So you need energy to change. So a dynamic character is someone who inputs some sort of energy and they change because of it. We also categorize characters according to their role in the story, and the two main categories are protagonist and antagonist. The protagonist is the main character, typically, and some stories may have more than one. And the antagonist is the character or force that opposes that protagonist. So it's an adversary, it stands against the protagonist. By the way, some people use the term hero to refer to the protagonist of a story. That's kind of a loose use of the term, but it's not always appropriate because we tend to think of heroes as people who are role models, people you look up to. And there are some protagonists in stories who are pretty awful people. We're probably going to read a story together about a protagonist who's a real monster. He has no conscience. He kills without remorse, and he's not anybody's role model. Well, at least I wouldn't think so. But he is definitely the central character of the story. And there are some stories where there really isn't a person who's an antagonist, but instead a force like nature or society in general or fate. So you can't always pinpoint exactly who the antagonist is. And sometimes the main conflict in a story is an inner conflict within the main character, the protagonist, in which case you'd say the protagonist and the antagonist in some ways are the same person. As we said, conflict is the disagreement, the struggle between opposing forces that usually triggers the plot. And I'm sure many of you are already aware that longer stories can have multiple conflicts and therefore multiple plot lines. Conflicts can be within the characters, as I said earlier. They can be internal conflicts, person versus him or herself, person versus self. But then most short stories also at least partly involve external conflicts, a conflict between the protagonist and somebody else, person versus person, or against nature, against society as a whole, or against the supernatural, against supernatural beings, against ghosts, against God or gods. You'd consider that those figures to go beyond nature. So internal conflicts, just to review, are conflicts that focus on the struggles characters have within themselves. And a lot of good fiction really is largely based on that. Setting, of course, is where the story takes place, but it also refers to the time setting. So it's the place and the time in which a story takes place. The physical setting can be sometimes it's very specifically defined. Sometimes it may range over a lot of places. And in a lot of stories, it may be just kind of vague. You may just get a sense that it's in a town or in a classroom. Sometimes you'll know exactly. It's New York City in 1963 in Harlem. So, and you may even have exact addresses. The chronological setting is when it happens. And again, that may be very specific. It may be a specific point in time, or it may stretch out over a great length of time. It's sometimes worthwhile to also identify the social setting of a story, that is, the kind of people among whom the story takes place. For example, one of the first stories we're going to be reading is set among middle schoolers, young people about your age, and that's significant that the kind of conflicts they have with each other are those that you typically do find among school-age children. And they are also related by their ethnicity and their social status, and that actually has a shape on how they has an effect on how they behave. So sometimes you can say, well, they're all students, or they are all working class people, or they're all rich people, or something like that. The theme of a work of literature is the main idea that the story communicates. And in some stories, it may be directly expressed by the author, and in some cases, the reader has to infer one. It's not simply what the story is about. If you say it's a love story, it's about love. Although sometimes we will loosely use the term theme to refer to that. It's a story about love, or about war, or about magic, or something like that. But if we ask you to identify the theme of a story, more often we're asking you to identify, well, what is the author saying, either directly or implying, about that topic? So instead of simply saying the story is about love, you could say the author shows through this story that love can overcome obstacles. A lot of people will identify as the theme of a story some kind of bit of advice you can take about life from it, and often it's a very positive one, like don't give up or something like that. That's more a moral of a story. We use that term to refer to the kind of lesson that the reader of a story can take away about how to make life better. But not all stories have a positive theme like that, or provide at the end a suggestion of, or imply any kind of advice about how to live life. They're just a sort of glimpse of how life works. So you can do it, or you can do things if you put your mind to it, would be more the moral of a story. The point of view of the story is the perspective, the point from which the story is being told. Most typically, stories are told in first person by a character in the story narrating the story herself or himself, or third person, narrated by a narrator who's outside the story. Three common modes, you could say, styles of point of view are the omniscient point of view, in which the narrator tells the story almost from every character's point of view at once, can get into different characters' heads. And the author who created the story, and so therefore knows what every character is thinking, or can make up what they're thinking, will tell you that. Omniscient means all-knowing. More common are limited narratives, limited points of view, in which the narrator will give us glimpses into the thoughts of one character. Sometimes you'll also get shifting point of view, where you'll get one chapter from one character's point of view, and another, it'll go on to give another character's point of view later on. Or a novel might actually go into different characters' points of view, but not jumping around over a lot of them like omniscient, but really sticking mostly with one. So that's limited. And then there's the first person, narrated by a character in the story. Okay. There is also a kind of story with an objective narrator, third person narrator, where the narrator simply tells you what happened, but never tells you what any character is thinking, as if they were just recording it through a camera. And that's known as objective point of view. We will talk about that at another point, but not now. Symbolism is not found in every story, but most works of literature will at least include a bit of symbolism, which is simply the use of an object to represent something else beyond itself. And typically a symbol gets its meaning. That meaning attaches to the symbol, the object, over the course of the story. It's not obvious what the symbol represents when it first appears. So it's a little bit different from, if you have a flag in a story, well, everyone knows if the American flag, it represents America in some sense. But you wouldn't say that the author is using it as a symbol unless they're trying to say something about the meaning of America in that story through the flag. So more commonly, when authors use symbols, they create the meaning of the symbol through the plot. Some symbols, like a red rose representing love, or a heart representing love are pretty commonplace. But still, it would get that meaning. You'd know for sure that the rose symbolizes love because it fits that way into the plot. The plot helps it mean that. And just so you know, in real life, as in many works of fiction, dogs are a common symbol to represent everything that's good in the world, at least as far as I'm concerned. And so, just to sort of reinforce that point, here's a picture of my dogs. And as you can see, they're pretty much good. So they represent everything good. And one last term to go over, genre. It's pronounced that way. That's sort of it comes from French. So we pronounce it genre in English, which is almost the way the French say it. It's related to words like generation or generate, which means coming from a family, to create through a family, from parents to children. So it basically means family. So we categorize works of literature into sort of family groupings. And very often, just like you may belong to multiple family groupings, works of literature can be categorized into different families or genres. So you can say, if it's only a few pages long, it's a short story, but it might be an adventure short story, or it might be a love short story. So any of those categories that multiple works of fiction, that more than one work of fiction can be fitted into, those are genres. There are some stories that would be really hard to classify. They kind of create their own genre, but almost all stories that I know of, there's at least one fairly well-known category that you could fit it into. But as I said, many stories could be put into more than one, so there's often not one right answer if we ask you what's the genre of a story. So, quick review. Basic elements of fiction are plot, conflict, character, setting, theme, point of view, symbolism, and genre. Hope you found that worthwhile. Thanks for watching.